Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Elisapesi I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research in that language.
Māloi lele, māloi lava mai. I'm your podcast host, Wanda Yermia Allen. Today's podcast is a special recording for Tongan Language Week, Wiki katoa ngai o le ea whakatonga. You will be hearing from soon-to-be Dr. Elisapesi Hepi Havea and also Mele Latunipulu, who have both just completed their studies here at the University of Waikato. Enjoy. Māloi lava mai. Writing the New World project is looking at, probably as the word that you talked about, rekindling, revitalising, and a bit of a reawakening for our 21st century generation to this amazing Indigenous literature.
I think the first one that comes to mind is the great poems that our late Queen Salote wrote about her life, about her children, about what happened in Tonga at the time. Those poems are still used by schools now in Tonga, and not only Tonga but all over the world. They've been used, those songs and those poems, for the Tongan Tawalonga and for other academic reasons as well.
Yeah, I think out of all the poets in Tonga, she is considered to be the most outstanding poet in Tonga.
She's using the Tongan language, so to have that those original poems translated into English, I don't know, Bessie, but up to now I haven't seen or find any translation. If there is any, I haven't come about it yet, but you just can't translate those Tongan poems. Those poems and songs that our late Queen Salote has written, because there isn't any English words that could really bring forth those meanings and those values that Queen Salote used in her poems and in her songs. And in Tonga, those songs and those poems is still used in Tonga by schools, used for Tongan Dawalunga, Tongan dance, and with important people coming over to Tonga, the Tongan people, they use those songs that Queen Salote wrote. They use those songs for dancing. They use those songs to share amongst friends and important people that coming over that are visiting Tonga. And I think that's that's why her work, her poems and her songs are very different from others, because she wrote those in Tongan, and to transfer those, to translate those Tongan poems and songs into English, there isn't just the right. You can explain it in English, but then to have a word you can say, yes, I can justify this, it will have the same meaning. You can't just find the right word for it. And for me that's why her poems are so different, so unique, and so it stood out.
I remember when I was high school, we were given a poem, one of Queen Salote's Ta'anga, and what's the Ta'anga kohayena kutu whakaunga?
I don't get the name, but I know the word.
So to translate that line into English, it's more like a question. Who is hiding? Something like that. So we were given that poem for us to translate into English. And even like the teacher that she was just, when we actually read out our poem, we just laughed because it doesn't make sense. When you read it in Tongan, it means a lot to you.
Yeah.
But when you translate it into your poem and you actually read it in English, you don't feel anything. It's
loses
just
the value. Right?
Yes, loses the value.
Yeah.
So, and I think, like you said, Wanda, there is an opportunity for us to go into, to think about it and expand, on that a bit more. And that has to be done by Tongans, because they are the ones who know about the meanings. And also, like, for example, for us, if we are given a poem, we can't even interpret it.
Yeah.
We have to go and ask the older people, the older generation, or we have to get like a dictionary or look for some vocabularies so that we, because, there is a poem that she wrote for her husband.
Okay.
And the Loka Siliva, the Loka Siliva. And I don't, if you know about it, Mele, but then I remember when I was high school, I came across something that, people were, someone was asking her, why didn't you put down, so Loka Siliva is silver lock, it's a lock, but it's silver. So someone asked her, why didn't you pick, and she referred her husband to be the silver lock, it's a lock. And they asked, why didn't you put Coden, Coca-Cola, Coden lock?
Yes.
And I can't remember, she had a very good reason for that.
Yeah.
Why she didn't refer her husband as a Coden lock,
Okay.
but just silver lock,
Yes.
So you just see Loka Siliva, and then you just, it's just a silver lock. But when you actually get to understand it, you have to find out why did she use silver lock
Yeah,
you know, what is the metaphor? You know, that metaphor. She is a lot of metaphors. It's just so we call it in Tongan heliake.
Yes. Okay.
You have to spend a whole year and try to interpret one verse of her poem. Yeah, it's just so deep and meaning.
But lies the richness in the meaning
and we also, and there are also other, not only Quintalote, but there are also other writers in Tonga. There's Ebelia Ofa and Konai Helu Thaman.
Konai Helu was one of the person that really resonate with with me and how I think about the literature, because from experience when I was at high school, I get to learn more about island fire and also You the Choice of My Parents. So those were the poems written by Konai Helu Thaman that I got the opportunity to study about when I was at high school, and up to now, you know, some of those key concepts that I've learned from those poems are still fresh in my head, and I really admire the way how she wrote those poems, so what she was thinking at that time. Some of the poems are like sad poems, like for example, The Island Fire. She was talking about the dying culture and how all those new or Western ideas are coming into Tonga, try to, you know, and how she wished that, you know, those Tongan culture can be rekindled in the future, you know, like go back to using the olden way of lives and traditional way of doing things, you know. And the poem You the Choice of My Parents, I remember when I was high school, we actually had to act that poem, and there are so many kind of interpretations that you can make to that particular poem. What do you think about that, the poem You the Choice of My Parents? What do you actually think that was, you know, the...
It kind of reminds me when I was in high school. I also had the chance to study You the Choice of My Parents, and at that time I thought that You the Choice of My Parents applies to arranged marriage, because reading the poem by itself, I mean, I think that everyone will think that the poem is based on arranged marriage. But I look at the poem this year actually. I look at the poem and reread it again and again. And I thought about it, and I thought about at the time that back in Tonga, at that time when Konai wrote the poem, there were issues about social, you know, how the hierarchy order in Tonga.
Elisapesi and Mele talk about how Konai's poem changes for them over time, in particular how traditional gendered roles are now performed in the 21st century, while still honouring cultural expectations. Elisapesi and Mele hold a fascinating discussion about how the poem now draws attention to social order, and in particular how agency allows for people to move within and between social hierarchies.
Because that order does not apply to the whole nation, but it always started at home. At home, there's an order at home, and then going from home to the community, to the church, and at school, there's a hierarchy order at school, and then to the whole nation as well. So when I read the poem again this year, I kind of think about that. Think about that social, the status, our status back in Tonga. Everyone everyone is studying, everyone is working, everyone is trying to reach up to that status in the society where they can see themselves being respected, where they see themselves being what's that word again?
Acknowledged?
Yes, being acknowledged by others. That's how I see the poem when I read it again. Comparing to when I was in high school, yes, I thought I was looking at arranged marriage, because the poem really, yes, it does really talk about arranged marriage back in Tonga, because at the time arranged marriage was really a thing in Tonga. Parents would do the choosing of the spouse for their children, and some of their children end up happy, and then there are others they didn't find that happiness. And that poem actually talks about that. But then while reading it, like I said, while reading it again this year, it kind of draw a picture of for me about the social status in Tonga back in the days. Especially, you know, how the hierarchy or in Tonga, there's the people and the nobles, and then the king. Yeah, so there's different interactions between people and people, but when you're interacting with nobles, that's a different different story about that. So yes, I was looking at that, Bessie, when I read the poem again. But I believe if anyone who hasn't read the poem, if that person read the poem, I know that the actual the arranged marriage, when a new person read the poem, I know that person will think about arranged marriage. But for someone who has been studying about that actual poem, that You, the Choice of My Parents, and then restudied it again, I think there will be another reasons for that. But that's just me. Just me.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing about when we're conducting research, particularly when it comes to Indigenous research. Thaman talks about that Tongan literature is filled with symbolism and imagery. And so as a Tongan person, you need to have insight into the culture to understand that. Do you guys want to talk a little bit more about that?
I think, John, what you just said, Wanda, based on the poem that we were just talking about, You, the Choice of My Parents, like what Mele mentioned, that when I was at high school, most of the thinking based around You, the Choice of My Parents is that the arranging marriage, you know, like parents have like based their choice on some key things, like looking for someone who is the heir of the family, you know, like for example, they want me to marry like the eldest son of a family, so that I inherit the land and all the properties. Also, someone who is well educated, someone who has who's rich, for example, you know, who has a car. Those are the key things that most of the you know, selection or choice were based.
Mele and Elisapesi talk about how the pursuit of social status has led to the way in which traditional roles are negotiated and performed in the home.
Happy has explained, when you read the poem, yes, it does put you, especially when you're a woman, it puts you into a vulnerable state. But when you step up and look at it closely at the poem, you will actually see that as what what happened in Tonga at the time. Not only with the chores and the responsibility of women, but as I had mentioned before, it's all to do about status, about your status in the community, whether you're a woman or a man. It talks about your status in the community. or in your family, or at church, at school, whatever society.
Is it still relevant now?
Following Mele's fascinating kōrero, both were asked whether the contemporary status of men or women is dependent on the performance of traditional roles.
What do you think, Bessie?
Well, it depends. But then, for me, if I have to answer that question from my personal experience, no. You know? Well, yes, and there's a yes and there's a no. You know, you can play your role, but it comes to a time where you think that you, as a woman in the family, you need to have your voice in the family, in the decision making. You know, you have your voice. And it comes to a time for me, I have to address, you know, if my husband has something that I do not agree, or decision that he will make, that I will have to how do you call it? I have to.
I think it's more like it's the decision making is not based on the husband, but you have a say to you talk about it over with your husband. I mean, today in Tonga, you talk it over, and then from there you decide together what decision for the whatever issue you're trying to make a decision of. But
you still know you have your, you know, you still do your role as a wife, according to our Tongan cultures and traditions. But just the way how it is explained in the poem itself, it's a bit, it's no longer that
it's loosen up a bit.
It's loosen up, it's loosen up a little bit, you know, because you as a woman, you know that you have a part to play in the family, and also you have a status, like what Mele was, you know, it's no longer like this, but it's more like there's a balance between me and my husband in decision making and all those kind of things, you know. But deep in my heart, I know what I'm supposed to do, but at the same time, I know that I have a voice, you know. And I have, and there might be some factors that, you know, contribute to that kind of perceptions. Might be different from how others may be back in Tonga, in other islands, in other villages. But I think, you know, you can see social media nowadays, and you can just see people's views, even in Tonga, you know. There's a huge difference, you know. You can see ladies, females, their voices out there, you know, and that shows how strong and powerful they are these days in compared to the past.
Yes,
you know?
yes. And hierarchical, there are still points of tension where we understand that there are protocols like the bar and how we engage, but it's done in a more, it's a different time, in terms of people having different fluidities in terms of decision making, like you're talking about. Now, just going back in terms of the topic about modernization, so Thaman talks about fire, the notion of rekindling. Can you talk about her fears?
The poem is Island Fire, and that poem has been the same with the eulogies of my parents. The poem Island Fire has been impacted my way of thinking about Tongan culture for a long time, since the time I get to read. And there's one word that is in the poem that has been, you know, the word rekindle. Conversation with someone or read a book that has that word rekindle, it's just automatically taking me back to that classroom and that moment where I heard the word, you know, and then the Tongan culture automatically come into my head.
Yeah.
Whenever I say, a mention or hear someone saying rekindle,
Yes.
even if they talk about something else, I already think about Tongan culture is dying, So, and that's how that poem has been, shaped the way how I thought and shaped in my thinking about the Tongan culture around it. And because Konai at that time, most of her poems, how I saw about it, was based on culture, was based on people, also nature. Some of the key things that she included in that was, like I said, poem, because she started by talking about how Tongan culture used to be like vibrant, the culture was vibrant and it was alive, but then westernization come into Tonga and all those ideas shape everything, and people get to adapt to those kind of Western ideas, and then they slowly move away from the Tongan traditional way of doing things and the values. And I think even she talked about garrison and all those kind of things, but then for me, probably she lost it of values, cultural values, Tongan cultural values, like for example the whakawei gola, the respect, love, and humility, tauhiva'a, keep a relationship, those kind of things. Those values, I think they're starting to, to lose or fade away from the Tongan people. And I think that around that time, Konai probably she was aware of what was going on around that time.
Just continuing on from Bessie, based on that fire, the words that she chose to use, embers of fire, those little embers signifies the dying culture. That little embers of fire is waiting to be rekindled by coconut leaves. So coconut leaves, it portrays the Tongan culture, the Tongan traditional way of doing things. But then at the last line she said kerosene is easier. So she was saying that the Tongan people at the time, to be more specific, I have to say that the Tongan people at the time were starting to get things easier. So getting the kerosene and just light up the fire and that's it, you have fire. But then getting the dry coconut leaves and to start the fire in the Tongan traditional way, that's not an easy thing to do. But then as Konai portrays in her poem, the culture is dying because of modernization and westernization. And people in Tonga, even today, they're using Western materials to replace the Tongan materials that were used for examples. They were used for Ta'awala. They were used for Ta'awala. That's just one example. So Konai, I think Konai at the time was looking at what will happen after 20 years if the Tongan people have used kerosene instead of the dry coconut leaves, then it will keep on changing. Tonga will keep on changing because they see things that is easier for them, rather than having the value, they keeping the value with them. That is our culture, and the traditional ways. It's very unique. Talking about the Ta'awala, making of the Ta'awala, it's very unique. The process, Bessie, it's a very long process, but once you you get used to it, it's not very long for you. But that process, it's not there anymore because people have replaced it with the Western materials because it's easy. It's more easy. You don't have to take a long process for that awala to complete. But just as Bessie has said, Konai Helu based most of her poems about the changing that is happening in Tonga. Not just the culture, but the changing with the with what I was saying, with how we do things daily activities in families, in society, in communities. And yes, but the really important thing for me is the words that she used. It's the words that she used and the poems. Some poems are very short, but those little words, they have so many meanings, and they yes, Bessie, and they're so powerful. And as Konai Helu mentioned in one of her essay, she said that if in order to understand her poems or indigenous writings, you need to know the context really well in order for you to really understand the deep value and the deep meaning behind those texts, those indigenous texts.
Absolutely. And one of the comments she makes is it's a critique really of non-Tongan people, non-Pacific people, not seeing the value of always dismissing Pacific literature as comparing it to Palangi literature because they do not understand the context.
Yes.
And because they do not understand the context, they therefore have these great opinions compared to their own values. But they miss the point, They miss the true meanings. They miss the richness of the imagery, the symbolisms, like most of our literature has.
Yes.
Pacific literature is not as valued as highly because of that deficit model, and because they're comparing it to Western frames.
As the conversation draws to a close, Elisapesi and Mele are asked what literary aspirations do they have for their children.
I would like my children to learn about our history, our story, through the Tongan literature, through stories that were written by Tongans. That's what I would like my children to learn, and also most importantly to learn about how the Tongans write their own literature in their own language, to know the words, to know the language, and how they are used to express ideas and opinions and issues and stories in a written work.
Things, and the only way how they may interact and to find their own Tonganness, if there is such a word as Tonganness, is to go through literature, to read the poem and get those books that were written by Tongans, because those simple Tongan poems, read them out. If there's a like the Tongan Language Week, teach them a poem, they can read it out. Then social media is, very popular. Teach them to read a poem and then just post it on Facebook. Will stay there forever, and then they focus on Tongan, on some of the Tongan literature. Seeing the fact that they were born and grew up here in New Zealand, they lack that part of accessing the Tongan culture. Give them those kind of things, let it live for the future.
Malo'o pito Mele and Elisapesi. Thank you so much for your contribution.